Welcome to Fossil Creek Tree Farm and Nursery. Today we're going to be talking about a good lawn, taking care of the weeds. And now is the primary time for pre-emergent, which is the best way to control weeds. Because, and we're also having a helicopter convention. They should all be landed soon. They're not after me. Pre-emergent is the best way to control weeds because it gets them when they're small. And as we know about all things biological or whatever, when they're tiny, they're not that tough. So that's why it works. And the ingredients in pre-emergence, there's not a whole lot of active ingredient since there doesn't need to be, since they're killing things that are very tiny. And a lot of the weeds that we have now too, there's not an effective post-emergent weed killer for them anyway. So it's best to prevent them in the first place, and then we don't have to deal with the post-emergent weed killers that are not as effective anyway. Especially if a weed gets very big, even the post-emergent weed killers, they're going to be effective when the weeds are small. If the weeds have gotten big, they're not going to do the job. And of course, as with all weed killers, they're effective when the weeds are actively growing. If the weeds are dormant, then no weed killer is going to do anything. So if you're in a situation where you're trying to kill a weed and it's dormant, it could be dormant from cold, or it could be dormant from just dry. It's not growing because it's too dry. Weed killer is not going to be effective unless the weed's got something going on. That's when the weed killer jumps into that process, disrupts it, and kills the weed. So there's got to be something going on. And right now, we're at the beginning of something going on with weeds. They're about to get started. Now's the time, hopefully before September 5th or 6th, you want to get your initial dose of pre-emergent down. And but before we get into that, I'll just say that the best weed preventer known to man is a very vigorous and healthy turf. If the turf is thick and healthy and got a real thick cover, a weed is going to have a tough time getting started there. So, and if it's not, you're kind of fighting a losing battle. If your turf is not vigorous and really got it going on, well then that's just an open invitation to weeds. And we don't want to put out the welcome mat. So first of all, get your turf healthy. And of course, kind of three things are involved there. Sunlight, contrary to what some people may think, grass is just a sun plant. You may talk about some that are shade tolerant or whatever, but basically grass is a sun plant. St. Augustine, which is a lower sun requirement than Bermuda, to be kind of happy, it needs 6 hours of sun. To be hanging on the edge, it needs 4 hours. If it's less than that, you're into ground covers or mulch or something else. So number one, it's best 8 hours of sun or more, and Bermuda requires more sun than St. Augustine. It's got to have, if it doesn't have 8 hours, it's just not going to perform. And of course, any of these can take it all day. They are sun-oriented plants, so all day is fine. But that's the key thing. And then fertilizing, watering, and mowing. Those are the key things. A site that'll work with a lot of sun, you're going to fertilize it, you're going to mow it, and we're going to require water. Obviously, we just finished a record length of time without rain. So if you're not watering, it's toast. There's not that dramatic of a difference between the water requirements for turf grasses, because when you read in some of the books and it says drought tolerant, like Bermuda is drought tolerant. Well, if it's in a drought and you leave it in a drought, it'll survive. But while it's in the drought, it's going to look awful. They're just talking about survival. They're not talking about looking good. If you want turf to look good, there's not going to be that big a difference in the turf grasses as to how much water they require to look good. So those are the four things. And of course, after you've got the site and you fertilized it, proper water, and then mowing, that's the other thing. Turf grasses, they kind of like to be mowed. Weeds do not. So that will stress weeds, and it makes turf grasses feel good. Yes?
I have Bermuda, and my grass, part of it is spent because of the lengthy heat and all the sun. So you're saying it'll come back after
Oh, yeah.
I water it?
Yeah.
Now, being that it gets pretty spent, can I still put the weed preventer on there?
Yeah.
Now?
Yes.
It'll be okay?
Yeah. In fact, what you'd probably want to do is, and I'll kind of give the the sequence. I wrote it down so I'll get it right. And I need help, but I put 6 numbers. Number 1, if you're this is the time to do it, mow. Mow the grass first, and then apply your fertilizer. Water it in deep, which means you want to get it down to the surface and you want to get the fertilizer kind of dissolved and into the soil. So you're not doing just a brief sprinkle. You want to get it down there and get it dissolved. Mother Nature may take care of that. And then wait a day or so, and then you can apply your pre-emergent. And then that's number 5. And number 6 is you're going to do the same to the pre-emergent that you did to the fertilizer. You're going to maybe not necessarily as deep watering, but probably around a ½ inch of watering to get it down to the soil surface and dissolve, because the pre-emergent, when you water it, get it down to the soil surface, it forms a barrier. And pre-emergent refers to the fact that you put it down before the weeds have emerged. It doesn't mean it won't let them emerge. They're going to germinate. When you have the pre-emergent down, it's watered in, it's dissolved, it forms a barrier, and you got it down before the weeds germinated. So that barrier is there. They actually germinate just from they're a seed, and they got the right temperature and moisture and everything. But when they hit that barrier, that tiny little thing, he starts to come out. He hits that barrier, that's it. Because he's so tiny, it just doesn't take much to do him in. He's frail as frail can be, and that's the most vulnerable moment, and boom, he's out. So, that's what we're doing. If you, of course, Bermuda, see, a lot of it is underground. It has underground stems, so the top can virtually disappear. It's gone into survival mode, so your Bermuda could look bad or almost disappear. When you water it, it's in survival mode. When you water it, boom, it's on. It's growing. So fertilizer is going to help get it going. Of course, now one of the other things, we'll jump back to having a vigorous lawn. Here, our soils are clay, and well, they're compacted clay. If they showed up last week, they wouldn't necessarily be compacted, but they've been here forever. So when it rains and you walk on them or you mow them or just gravity over time, they get compacted. and that makes them slow to absorb water. There's no air going back and forth, and pretty slow to absorb fertilizer. If you have some exposed clay, you could do the experiment of water it, and you just watch it go. It's not going to disappear into the ground, and you go, "Ooh, where'd that go?" Now, if you do the same thing on a raised bed, the water just disappears into the bed. Well, our turf is typically, soil is not that. It's going to go sideways. It's not really going to want to penetrate. So if the water doesn't penetrate, how well do you think the fertilizer penetrates? Now, the good news is, for pre-emergence, we're not wanting them to penetrate. We want them to be on the surface. That way, they form that barrier. So that's how they function. But if you, speaking to a Bermuda grass, I had a little serendipity, my experiment, years ago. I had Bermuda at the back of my yard, and I was going to make a flower bed bigger. So I ran my tiller around a few times, and then I decided, and this Bermuda grass was looking pretty pathetic because I gave it tough love without the love, just tough. Didn't take care of it, didn't water it, and it looked anemic and in survival mode. And then after I got to thinking, it's a dangerous thing, I decided not to make my flower bed as big. So there was like a swath this wide around where I didn't do the flower bed. It's just back here. Well, I took care of the stuff in the flower bed, but I didn't do anything to that Bermuda in front of it. And I was busy at my work, so I wasn't paying the most attention. And 2 weeks later, I went out there, and where I had tilled, that Bermuda was the most gorgeous shade of green, coming on strong. And I hadn't watered it or fertilized it, or it was continuation of tough. And that far to the edge of where I had tilled, where the old Bermuda was untouched, it was still anemic, yellow and light green. No improvement whatsoever. So that was like one of my aha moments of, with our soil around here, the compactation of the soil is a big hindrance. So I'm saying that because it's possible that it would be worthwhile to do a aeration, over that. You can rent them. The better ones, have a little tube and it's got a spring in it, and they have weight on them, or you put weight on them. It pushes it down into the ground. That tube takes a little core of soil, and as it rolls, it pulls it out. Well, when the weight's off of it, that spring ejects the soil, and it just rolls along, pulling out little plugs. And that's basically what I did with my tiller. I only made 2 light passes, so I just kind of chopped it up a little bit. So that's what the aerator does. So it gets air in the soil, it helps water penetrate, and one of the key things is if you fertilize and then water it, fertilizer is actually not going to run off into the street or the local creek. It's actually going to penetrate down into the soil. So the combination of, you get better water penetration and air exchange, and your fertilizer that you apply is actually getting down into the soil, you're going to see a pretty rapid response. So that's worthwhile. So, and see, I have people say, well, I fertilized and it still doesn't look like it improved a little, but well, that could be the cause. It's the nature of our soil. It doesn't want to help. You have to make it help. So.
Can you recommend a source for a renting aerator?
I can't.
Okay.
But, and it doesn't have to be one that pulls plugs. That's kind of the top of the line. If it's just one that, punches holes, that are kind of when it punches holes, it kind of breaks it up a little, loosens it up a little. That's a benefit. See, the deal I did with my tiller, I didn't go that deep. I probably didn't go an inch, but I kind of chopped up the surface to where it had some openings. So it's kind of a, any aeration is way better than none.
So even like those, I don't know what they're called, but they look like a pitchfork. That would still do it too?
Sure.
Okay.
The key there is, have you got any vacation time? Because
Oh, yes.
it's going to be labor intensive. But of course, then again, too, there are things like that you could, if you had something like that, you could just periodically do small sections to where you're not trying to do it all. Yeah, there are. Yeah, there. In fact, there's some little tool. It'd probably be easier than that. You've seen them. I don't know. They've got like spikes on wheels. That kind of. That you just push across, and that way all you're doing is putting a little weight on it and pushing it rather than. That's. But anything that's chopping it up a little bit, because that really is. That's the. Uh, The easier way, like I said, the more vigorous your turf, the less you have to do to fight off weeds. So, let's see. Before I forget, we got
Thank you.
handouts.
Will there be homework?
No, there's no quiz.
How about one of those? You just walk over
There you go. But there's the fitness model. The spikes that you put on your feet. Yeah.
Marching to Pretoria.
Yeah. You might want to do that in the dark, because if your neighbors see you out there, there might be a 911 call. Yeah. But I'll do the fertilizers, then we'll go to the pre-emergent products. And of course, fertilizers, typically when they talk about coverage, when something gives you a coverage on the front of the bag, most of the time that's talking about, that's how far it will go if you apply 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. But you would want to do at least a half a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet when you're fertilizing. A pound of nitrogen is not, per 1,000 square feet, is not overdoing it. So sometimes on the front of a bag, when it says 4,000 square feet, that means there's 4 pounds of nitrogen in that bag. That's how they come to the calculation of how much it covers. But like I say, if you were to put half a pound, that would still be enough to help get things underway. But that's kind of the standard way that they calculate the coverage. We've got, there we go. We've got a winterizer. Going to be 90 degrees today, but it's time for a winterizer. And it's a 10014, and of course first number is nitrogen, and middle number is phosphorus, which our soils here typically have an ample supply of phosphorus, so we don't really need to add it. And the phosphorus, nitrogen is very water soluble, so you put it on there, you water it in, it goes into solution, and the grass roots take it up. Over time, if it's not taken up, it tends to leach away. Either the grass absorbs it or it will leach away. Phosphorus is not that water soluble. It will accumulate. So that's why you don't really need to, and our soil has a bunch of it, so you don't need to add it over time. The last number potassium, 14%, and that's kind of one of the reasons why this one has the winterizer tag, is because potassium helps with winter hardiness, the toughness of the plant to deal with the winter. And see, this one says covers up to 5,000 square feet. And then we got K8, which is a 15-510. And then we also, and both of those are synthetics. And then we also have an organic, and all the organics are going to have less, fertilizer of the ingredients, like, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. This is a 614. And this one could go up to 4,000, or if you wanted to do a heavy feeding, you'd be doing it over a couple thousand square feet. Kind of the difference there is that organics, over time, you're kind of feeding the soil. You're increasing the microbial activity in the soil, and that helps the fertility over time. So that one will kind of improve the situation over time. Which is not to say that you have to do one or the other. You could do primarily this, and then once in a while you might, perk it up a little bit with a synthetic, but I think most people that do organics tend to just do organics. And let's see. Okay. Okay. Now we'll go with the pre-emergence. And of course, to go over it again, when we say pre-emergent, just to define that technicality, if you go out in your yard and you see the weeds, we're not talking pre. That's post. If you can see it, that's post-emergent. Pre-emergent is you go out there, you don't see them, they haven't emerged. They're still, so that's the time to, and I mention that because we do have a product here, the weed beater. It is a pre-emergent and a post-emergent. These two, the turf and grass preventer, and you can also use this in ornamental beds. But that one, the name used on it is Dimension, since we can't pronounce the scientific name, so we call it Dimension. And it's for grassy weeds and will retard or prevent a bunch of broadleaf weeds, but grassy weeds is the main target on that one. And then
isn't that going to interfere with the weeds, the grass itself, the turf? Okay.
Because remember, it deals pre-emergent. It deals with little bitty babies. The turf grass is established. The things that can, so there's very little ingredient here. It can kill a plant when it's tiny. It's kind of like a chicken just coming out of its egg. What would it take? I mean, you can make a loud noise, it might die. But that's the reason why post-emergence, which have to be stronger because they're killing a bigger weed, they can also cause discoloring of turf. In fact, this one, it's most of our lawns around here are Bermuda. There are some St. Augustine. This one actually says on there, don't use this unless you can tolerate temporary discoloration of St. Augustine. And that's, why is it discoloring? it's kind of stressing it out. Not enough to kill it, but it's stressing it out. So that's what speaks to what you're talking about is, a weed killer can be a stress on a grass. And of course, all of these, basically they'll say for use on an established turf. If you just sodded 6 weeks ago, you're still in the establish the grass mode. You're not in the prevent, weed mode. And of course, when you're in the just get it started mode, you can take, it's pretty much a given, you're going to have some weeds because the turf is not established enough and thick enough to hold them off. But the grass is still being established, so you don't want to put anything on there that would stress the grass. You're just growing it at that point. But once it's established, you can do these. This one won't stress Bermuda, which is the primary. And the dimension for grassy weeds will not do dandelions. Take care of those. Gallery is a broadleaf pre-emergent. The golf courses couldn't live without it. That's why when you look down the fairway, it's grass. It's not dandelions and henbit and all that kind of stuff. This one will cover a couple thousand square feet. And dimension, now it'll say up to 5,000 square feet. But if you read the label on the back, there's a north dose and a south dose. And we're in the south. And it'll probably do here about 3,000 to 3,500 square feet. And then this one, it'll also say, it could do a big coverage, but here in the south, this one, probably about 2,500 square feet. And of course, the pre-emergence, we went through the sequence, you mow, you fertilize, you water, if you're going to, fertilize. You don't have to fertilize before you do it. You could do that later, but if you wanted to do it at the same time, that would be the sequence. But these guys, after you apply them, you water them in immediately. That activates them. If you don't water them in adequately, they're not activated. So they don't expire, but they don't go to work until you water them in. So about a half an inch. This one, since it's a pre and post, the post part is you water first, and what you're doing, that's a light watering. You're wetting the leaves of the weeds, and then you spread it, and you leave it on there for 48 hours before you water it in. And it hits the wet leaf of a weed, dissolves, and is absorbed into the weed, and that's how it kills it.
It's a contact herbicide as well as the root herbicide?
Yeah, it's pre and post. And the post, you put it on a wet weed, leave it for 48 hours, and that's the post emergent. And then 48 hours, when you water it in, that takes it down to the soil level, and then it's in the pre-emergent mode. Anything that germinates and tries to grow through it, that's when that layer of pre-emergent takes it out. And let's see. Of course, a spreader on the back of the bags, they will give you the settings. And basically on these guys, since they are a relatively small granule, if you have a spreader and it's not listed on there, basically you're talking a pretty small opening since they're a pretty fine granule. So I would, if all else fails, the smallest setting that as you're pushing, you can see it's putting some out because it doesn't take very much. I mean, it's not a huge bag, and it's a small granule. And the pre-emergence, the active ingredient, it just doesn't take very much of it because, we're killing tiny, tiny things. So a small opening, and, if you were to go back and forth and you've covered it and you still have a little left, you can, go crossways and spread it. The main thing is you want to get coverage, you want to distribute it, and that for it to be spread to form that barrier. And let's see. Any other questions on those? We're good. Okay. The weed seeds live in fear of, but since I'm, and of course, on these, it would be a good idea to pre-emergence in 90 days. You do a supplemental. That will greatly increase the effect. A booster, you could call it, 90 days, and then so if we're doing it now, then that takes us to, you got September, October, November, so December 1st. And then the next time to apply it will be in, late winter. You're talking in the neighborhood of the end of January, early February. And actually, one of the weather things that kind of helps with the measurement there is you're doing it a week or two. Let's see. A week or two before the last frost. Or another way of looking at it is about that time, and it'd probably be earlier than that because our last frost, what was it? 2017, the last freeze was January 8th. So who knows? But the other way to kind of time it is around that time of year, if you have 4 consecutive days where the temperature is like 65 or 70 degrees, that's what gets weed seeds going. So then again, you would do the same thing. You apply your pre-emergence, and then 90 days after that, you do a booster. And one of the things that helps with is if you've got grass burrs that show up in summer, late spring, early summer, that booster 90 days after the first one in spring or winter, that's going to take care of those. And if you got those, and you might have to have a more rural property for those, but if you have those, you have the worst. And if you don't think so, step on one barefoot, and we'll have immediate agreement. I stepped on one as a kid, and that was my introduction to Texas. It wasn't a good start, but catching horny toads made up for it. So anyway, of course, I'll just give a few things about getting the grass going. Mowing's the key thing. On Bermuda, you're mowing at 1.25 to 1.5 inches height. And to give you the bad news, it'd be best if during the season you mowed more than once a week. That'd be best, but yeah, well, once a week. And of course, one of the key things there is that you don't never want to take off more than 1/3 of the grass blade height in one mowing, because if you take off more than that, that's kind of like taking off your shirt and your hat and going to the beach all day when you haven't been there in a while. All of a sudden you had some cover from that taller turf. That was all removed, and you're exposed to the sunlight that you haven't been exposed to at all. That stresses out grass. So, and if you mow minimal once a week, but more would be better. And of course, as I said earlier, grass likes it and weeds don't. St. Augustine, 2 to 2.5 inches. And then of course on Bermuda, it's a heavy feeder, so fertilize it late March, early April. And then every 8 weeks or so, your last fertilizing would be, for Bermuda, would be late September, early October.
So give me the dates you get for Bermuda.
You start late March or early April, and then every 8 to 9 weeks. And then your last fertilizing would be late September, early October would be the last one on Bermuda. St. Augustine is not as heavy a feeder, so it would be April, early June, and early September. So 3 times. Bermuda, you're probably typically going to go 4 times. And of course, St. Augustine, you're not going to be fertilizing in the real heat of the summer. And I didn't touch on it, but I mentioned watering. When you do water, you want to water, during spring and fall, like the equivalent of an inch of rainfall per week. In the real hot part, it could be 1.5 inches to 2 inches per week. And be best to water early in the morning, like 6 or 7 or 8, even 5. But fungus needs 6 hours of a wet leaf to get underway. And if you water early in the morning, you never have a wet grass leaf for 6 hours, because as soon as the sun is up, it's dry pretty quickly. So, and of course, you're typically you're going to want to, as we spoke earlier about the soil's hesitancy to absorb water, you may have to, in that morning, run it in 2 cycles, because if you just let it go to put a good drenching down, at some point it may just start running off, and in which case it's wasted. So you may, hit it at 5 or 6 and give it a couple hours and then do an additional amount. And that way, the second watering chases the first one deeper in the ground. And it chases it down. Gravity's on our side. But if you water more often and less when you do it, it sounds caring. You don't make your grass go thirsty for as long. But the negative that achieves is if you water less and more often, water never really goes deep. So you're cultivating, specifically creating a shallow root system, because that's the only place that the water gets to. And that doesn't take as long to dry out and show stress. So sometimes when I tell people you need to water more, when you water, and not as often, and they go, well, if I don't water it every day, it wilts. Well, they have a thin layer of roots because they don't water very much and they water often. So that's where the roots go to, because that's the only place there's ever water. So how long does it take that to dry out? No time. So that's why you're trying to get it to go deep.
live in an HOA community. When they laid my lawn, they laid it over a lot of rock. They didn't have a good surface. Can I build up on that, put a little bit of soil to start building up? Is that something I could do, or am I going to smother the grass?
Well, you can't really build up significantly.
Yeah.
Now, you can,
So I don't want to have to figure it all out and start over.
yeah. Well, and of course that speaks to if anybody's at that creation point, before you put it down, now's your chance. If nothing else, if you don't add anything, if at least you cultivate it, you at least give it a shot where it's most vulnerable, getting started to get going. But
talk to my landscaper.
yeah.
Can we amend the soil with like gypsum or anything? Does that help?
Well, you can. That kind of speaks to our friend here. Organic fertilizers tend to build up the fertility of the soil, whatever soil there is. You can use this. You can also spread compost. It's kind of a different type of organic fertilizing. So you can do those things, but and over time, when you and of course there will be grass that dies, and just kind of it's an organic thing, so it'll kind of build up some organic debris, which will help. And not thatch. It'll kind of break up and go down, into the soil, which that will help. But you know, um, spreading compost or organic fertilizer, helps to improve the fertility. And of course, um, none of the plants of any type are going to exist without the microbes that are in the soil, because of all the fungus, and of course I heard a guy one time was talking about organic fertilizer, and he said he gave the number of now I can't think of the word, the little tiny microscopic worms that are in the soil, nematodes. He said there's like 350 of them, and maybe 20 or 25 of them are pests. The others are working in our behalf, and that's kind of the same story on fungus. There are a bunch of fungi that exist on plant roots that the plant couldn't function without them. It's not like plants on its own and it deals with everything. There are symbiotic relationships. They're helping each other out, and that's not the exception. That's pretty much the rule. So anything you do to improve, the level of the microbes in the soil, since by far most of them are beneficial, and the ones that aren't beneficial, if you're aiding and abetting the ones that are good, it just makes their life more difficult. They tend to be a problem when it's out of balance and the good guys are insufficient. If you have sufficient good guys out there, things tend to go along pretty well. So that would be the approach I'd have on that. And I think that pretty well covers it. And if anybody has any questions, thank you guys for tuning in, and happy fall.